If nobody understands him in the next 60 seconds, a $2 billion deal will die in silence. The voice of Kenji Nakamura cut through the glass-walled conference room high above Manhattan. Calm but heavy with pressure as he stood at the head of the table speaking fluent Japanese, expecting precision, expecting respect, expecting results. But what he received instead was confusion, blank stares, and the uneasy shifting of executives who suddenly realized they had no idea what he was saying. The interpreter hesitated, sweat forming at his temple as he tried to keep up. But the translation came out wrong, fragmented, dangerously off rhythm, and across the polished oak table, American executives began exchanging glances that said everything without words: doubt, frustration, and the slow collapse of trust. Down below in the same building, Aaliyah Johnson moved quietly through the restaurant floor carrying empty glasses and polished silverware, unnoticed like background noise in a world that never paused for her presence. Her uniform simple, her posture calm, her eyes constantly observing more than she revealed. Above her the negotiation was supposed to define empires. Below her she was just another waitress finishing a double shift. But something changed when a server radio crackled with urgency about the failing meeting upstairs and a passing assistant muttered that the Japanese guest was becoming impossible to understand. Aaliyah paused for half a second, her hand tightening slightly around the tray, not because she was afraid, but because she recognized something. In those words, a pattern, a distortion of meaning that only someone fluent could catch. Upstairs the tension escalated as Kenji Nakamura repeated a key clause slowly, deliberately, expecting it to be understood this time. But instead the interpreter stumbled again and the room reacted immediately. A senior executive leaned back and whispered, "We might lose this deal," while another checked his phone as if escape was already an option. Kenji's expression did not change, but something cold settled in his eyes, the kind of silence that forms when power is still present but no longer effective. And in that exact moment Aaliyah looked toward the elevator doors, as if deciding something she had avoided deciding for a very long time. She placed the tray down carefully, smoother than necessary, and walked toward the service hallway where the sounds of clinking glass faded behind her, unaware that the next words spoken upstairs would decide not just the deal, but everything that followed, and that for the first time in years, she was about to step into a room where no one would expect her to understand a single word. Aaliyah Johnson stepped into the private elevator without hesitation, though her reflection in the polished steel doors revealed nothing but a quiet woman in a simple uniform carrying the weight of a double shift. The numbers on the floor panel rising as the city skyline stretched beyond the glass walls like a silent witness to decisions made far above her world. When the doors opened on the 42nd floor, the atmosphere changed immediately. The air felt heavier, sharper, filled with tension that did not belong to her but somehow called to her attention. Two security assistants stood outside the conference room but barely looked at her as she passed, assuming she was there to deliver something and not to interrupt anything important. Inside the room, Kenji Nakamura stood at the head of a long table, his presence controlled but visibly strained, his voice steady in Japanese as he repeated a critical clause in the contract, while across from him American executives leaned forward with forced patience that was starting to fracture. The interpreter, a man in a gray suit, wiped his forehead and attempted once again to translate, but the words came out misaligned, softening legal precision into vague phrasing that shifted the entire meaning of the agreement. A senior executive shook his head slowly and whispered that this was becoming a liability. Another glanced toward the exit as if already calculating the financial damage of walking away. Kenji noticed the shift immediately, his eyes tightening just slightly, not in anger but in recognition that communication itself had failed him in a foreign room where his authority no longer carried clarity. At that exact moment Aaliyah stepped inside, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of presence that changed the rhythm of attention in the room. A few heads turned, confused by her appearance. One assistant immediately tried to gesture her back toward the door, but she did not move. Instead she looked directly at the projection screen where the contract terms were displayed, then at the interpreter, then at Kenji, and in a calm voice she said that the translation was incorrect. The room went still. The interpreter blinked in disbelief and asked who she was, but Aaliyah did not answer that question. Instead she repeated a line from the Japanese statement in perfect pronunciation, then translated it into precise American English that made the meaning unmistakably clear. The clause was not a suggestion. It was a binding condition that affected the entire valuation structure of the deal. Silence followed immediately, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that signals collapse was avoided by seconds rather than strategy. Kenji's gaze fixed on her with sudden intensity as if seeing her for the first time. The executives shifted again, but this time with uncertainty replaced by surprise. The interpreter tried to respond but stopped halfway, realizing his version had been incomplete. Aaliyah continued, calmly clarifying another section, then another, her voice steady as if she had been in that room the entire time. When she finished, no one spoke for several seconds, and in that silence Kenji Nakamura finally lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement that something unexpected had just altered the entire trajectory of the negotiation. And across the room one question began forming in every mind at once. How could someone they had never noticed understand everything they had failed to hear? The silence in the conference room did not break easily. It settled instead like a weight that pressed against every executive at the table as Kenji Nakamura slowly turned his head toward Aaliyah Johnson with an expression that carried both caution and curiosity. Because in his world precision was everything, and the difference between survival and collapse often lived inside a single mistranslated clause. The interpreter shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that his authority had just been replaced without warning, while a senior executive leaned forward and asked who exactly had allowed a restaurant staff member into a secured negotiation space. But Kenji raised one hand slightly, stopping the interruption without speaking, his eyes never leaving Aaliyah as if recalculating the entire room around her presence. Aaliyah stood still near the entrance, her posture calm but not submissive, as though she understood every layer of tension without needing it explained. Kenji finally spoke in English, his accent precise but firm, asking her where she learned Japanese at that level. The question echoed across the polished table, and for a brief moment even the interpreter stopped breathing. Aaliyah did not answer immediately. Instead she looked at the projected contract screen again, then at the misaligned translation notes printed beside the interpreter's laptop, and only then did she respond softly that she had studied linguistic structure and cross-cultural communication during her time at New York University before leaving the program for personal reasons. The room reacted with subtle disbelief, not because the answer was dramatic, but because it did not fit the expectation they had formed about her. Kenji leaned slightly forward, asking her to clarify one more section of the contract, deliberately choosing a paragraph that had caused the most confusion. The interpreter attempted to interject, but Kenji raised his hand again, signaling silence. Aaliyah stepped closer without hesitation, reading the Japanese text under her breath before translating it into clear, structured English that preserved not only meaning but legal intent, each word landing with accuracy that removed ambiguity from the room entirely. One executive quietly checked the revised wording and realized the deal was not failing because of disagreement, but because of misunderstanding, and that realization changed the temperature of the room instantly. Kenji exhaled slowly, not in relief yet, but in acknowledgement that control had partially shifted. He asked her why she was working as a waitress if she possessed such ability, and this time Aaliyah hesitated, her eyes lowering slightly as she explained that life had required her to step away from formal education to support family responsibilities. Her voice steady but carrying the weight of decisions made outside of ambition. Something in that answer softened the tension but did not remove the curiosity. Kenji studied her for a long moment before asking her to stay for the remainder of the negotiation as an observer, not as staff, but as someone who could verify meaning in real time. The interpreter looked visibly shaken, realizing his role was no longer central, while the executives exchanged uncertain glances as the structure of authority inside the room quietly reorganized itself. Aaliyah did not respond immediately, but after a brief pause she nodded once, stepping fully into the room for the first time, not as background presence but as an active force inside a decision that carried billions of dollars. And as she took a seat near the edge of the table, Kenji's phone vibrated once with a secured message from his corporate team flagging her identity as something previously unclassified. A detail that made his expression change slightly, because now the question was no longer whether she could translate, but why someone like her had remained invisible until this exact moment. Aaliyah Johnson sat at the edge of the long conference table, as if she had always belonged there, though the weight of the room still pressed differently against her presence. Because now every executive was aware that the quietest person in the room had become the most important variable in a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. Kenji Nakamura remained standing for several seconds longer than necessary, his eyes shifting between the contract projection and Aaliyah as if recalculating the structure of trust itself. The interpreter no longer spoke unless directly addressed. His earlier confidence replaced by silence that felt heavier than words. One executive finally broke the tension by asking whether they should pause the session and recalibrate the translation protocol. But Kenji answered, without looking away from Aaliyah, saying that no pause was needed if the truth was finally being communicated correctly. Aaliyah kept her gaze lowered slightly, not out of submission but out of focus, as if she was listening to patterns in language that others were only hearing as noise. Kenji then requested the next clause, deliberately choosing one that had been marked as ambiguous in previous legal reviews. The interpreter hesitated before speaking, but Aaliyah raised her hand slightly, not interrupting but signaling alignment. Then she listened carefully to the Japanese phrasing and translated it into English with precise legal structure that removed all prior confusion. The effect was immediate. One of the American executives leaned back and quietly admitted that the clause now made sense in a way it had not before. Another began rewriting notes in real time. The atmosphere shifted from uncertainty to controlled clarity. But beneath it remained a deeper question that no one wanted to ask aloud. Kenji finally sat down, folding his hands together on the table, and asked Aaliyah directly how long she had been able to do this level of translation without recognition. The room waited for her answer, expecting either pride or exaggeration, but her response was simple and grounded. She explained that language had always been something she observed rather than studied in isolation, that she had spent years listening, reading, and comparing structure across contexts, but had never been in a position to apply it professionally. Kenji absorbed this quietly, then asked why someone with such ability would remain in a position where she was serving tables instead of shaping negotiations. Aaliyah paused again, this time longer, and for the first time her composure showed a subtle fracture of memory rather than confidence. She explained that life circumstances had forced her to step away from formal education and prioritize family stability, that opportunities often required timing she did not have, and that she had learned to adapt rather than announce her potential. The answer did not sound like self-pity. It sounded like accounting, factual and restrained. Kenji nodded, slowly, as if filing away information that redefined everything he thought he understood about talent and visibility. Then he leaned forward and made a decision that shifted the structure of the meeting entirely. He stated that from this point forward Aaliyah would remain in the room not as staff but as linguistic verification for every clause that followed. One executive objected quietly, concerned about protocol and confidentiality, but Kenji cut through the objection with a single sentence, stating that confidentiality had already been compromised earlier through misunderstanding, and accuracy now mattered more than hierarchy. The room fell into reluctant acceptance. Aaliyah did not celebrate the shift. She simply adjusted her posture slightly, as if stepping into a responsibility she had never requested but was now expected to carry. And as the next segment of the contract appeared on the screen, Kenji noticed something on his secured phone again. A second alert from his corporate intelligence team indicating that her academic records had been partially redacted at institutional level. A detail that made him look at her with renewed attention, because what had seemed like coincidence was now beginning to resemble intentional absence. And for the first time since entering the room, Kenji Nakamura stopped thinking about the deal itself and started thinking about the person who had just made it possible for it to survive. Aaliyah Johnson remained seated at the conference table as the negotiation resumed, but the atmosphere around her had fundamentally changed, because every word now passed through her understanding before it reached meaning. And Kenji Nakamura had quietly accepted that she was no longer an external observer but an active filter between success and failure. The next contract segment appeared on the screen marked as revenue distribution and liability structure. And immediately the interpreter attempted to resume his role, but Kenji raised his hand once again, not with frustration this time, but with certainty, requesting that Aaliyah verify the translation before anything was spoken aloud. She leaned slightly forward, eyes scanning the Japanese text with calm precision, and when she began to speak, her voice carried the same controlled rhythm as before, translating clause after clause with clarity that removed every layer of ambiguity. The American executive stopped interrupting because interruption no longer helped. What mattered now was accuracy. One of them even adjusted his notes to match her phrasing instead of the official interpretation, and in that adjustment the power dynamic shifted even further without anyone formally acknowledging it. Kenji observed everything silently, his attention now divided between the contract and the woman who had effectively stabilized it. After several minutes he finally asked a question that was no longer about language but about origin. He asked where exactly she had learned to recognize structural meaning across legal and cultural systems with such consistency. Aaliyah paused before answering, her eyes briefly shifting toward the glass wall that overlooked the city below. And she explained that her academic path had focused on linguistics and international communication frameworks at New York University before personal circumstances forced her to leave before completion. She did not elaborate further, but the simplicity of her explanation created more questions than answers. Kenji leaned back slightly, studying her with a quieter intensity. Then he made a decision that surprised even his own executive team. He stated that she would be formally added as an interim language consultant for the remainder of the negotiation, not as a courtesy but as a requirement for accuracy. A senior executive immediately raised concern about confidentiality and corporate protocol, but Kenji responded calmly that confidentiality was already at risk whenever meaning was lost, and that precision now outweighed tradition. The room accepted the decision without further resistance, because resistance no longer had a logical foundation. Aaliyah did not react emotionally to the change in status. She simply adjusted her position slightly in the chair, as if accepting a responsibility she had always been prepared for but never asked to hold. The negotiation continued for another 40 minutes, and with her presence the contract moved from unstable interpretation to consistent alignment. Every clause confirmed in real time, every misunderstanding corrected before it could spread. But beneath the efficiency of progress, Kenji's attention kept returning to one detail that had not yet been explained. A message on his secured device indicating that her academic records had been deliberately fragmented across institutional systems, a pattern suggesting intentional suppression rather than absence. And as he read that message again, he looked across the table at Aaliyah not as a translator, not as a waitress, but as someone whose visibility had been interrupted long before this room ever existed. And for the first time, he considered that the real story was not how she had entered this negotiation, but how many rooms like this one she had never been allowed to enter at all. A faint shift in atmosphere moved through the conference room as the negotiation entered its most sensitive phase, where numbers were no longer just numbers but representations of risk, control, and future dominance across markets that stretched far beyond Manhattan. Aaliyah Johnson remained focused, her attention moving between the Japanese document and the English projection with a calm precision that made the interpreter's earlier role feel increasingly obsolete. Kenji Nakamura no longer questioned her presence. Instead, he relied on it, pausing each time before speaking to allow her verification. And with every confirmation she gave, the contract became more stable, more aligned, more real. Yet something in Kenji's expression had begun to change, not toward the deal itself, but toward her, as if the logic of business had temporarily been replaced by the logic of observation. During a short pause in the negotiation, he received a second secure update on his device, this one more detailed than before, indicating that Aaliyah Johnson's academic history had not only been fragmented but partially sealed under institutional restrictions tied to privacy enforcement requests, a detail that made no sense in a normal academic record. Kenji's eyes narrowed slightly as he read it. Then he looked across the table at her again, this time not as a participant in the negotiation but as a subject of unanswered structure. Aaliyah noticed the shift in his gaze but did not react immediately, continuing to review the next clause when Kenji finally spoke in a lower tone, asking her directly whether anyone had ever formally recognized her language ability in a professional capacity. The question caused a subtle pause in the room, because it was no longer about translation, it was about validation. Aaliyah hesitated before responding, explaining that she had once been part of an academic evaluation program but had left before formal certification, and that after that point her work history had remained inconsistent due to personal responsibilities that required immediate financial stability. Her tone remained steady but carried an underlying finality, as if the subject was not open for reinterpretation. Kenji listened carefully, then leaned back slightly, his expression tightening not in skepticism but in realization that systems often measured only what they could formally record, not what actually existed. He then turned to the executives and stated that moving forward all critical clauses would require dual verification, one from the legal team and one from Aaliyah. The room reacted quietly, not in disagreement but in recalibration, because authority had just been redistributed without ceremony. Aaliyah did not acknowledge the change, instead she continued working through the document, but Kenji's attention remained partially fixed on her, and after a moment he asked a question that shifted the entire emotional weight of the room. He asked what had originally led her to study languages at such depth if she had never intended to use them professionally. The question lingered longer than expected before she answered, her voice softer now but still controlled. explaining that she had always been drawn to meaning beneath surface expression, to the structure of communication itself, and that understanding language had once been a way to understand people, but circumstances had forced her to prioritize survival over specialization. The answer was simple, but it created a silence that felt heavier than any disagreement earlier in the meeting. Kenji nodded slowly, then closed his tablet for a moment, signaling a temporary pause in negotiation, something that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the room, because pauses at this level were not casual, they were strategic, and as he looked at Aaliyah again, it became clear that the negotiation had stopped being only about the contract, and had begun shifting toward something none of them had prepared for, a question of how someone like her had remained invisible for so long in a world that depended on exactly her kind of clarity. A heavy silence settled across the conference room after Kenji Nakamura paused the negotiation entirely, something that had not happened since the beginning of the session, because pauses at this level of business were not interruptions but signals that the entire structure of decision-making was being reassessed. Aaliyah Johnson remained seated, her hands resting lightly near the contract documents, her expression calm but attentive, as if she could sense that the direction of the room was about to shift again. Kenji slowly closed his tablet and leaned forward, his voice steady but noticeably lower as he addressed both his executive team and the interpreter, stating that the negotiation would not continue until a full verification of translation integrity and participant capability was completed. The interpreter visibly tensed, while the executives exchanged uncertain looks, unsure whether this was caution or strategy. Kenji then turned his attention directly to Aaliyah, and for the first time the room felt less like a corporate negotiation and more like a structured interrogation of truth. He stated that his corporate intelligence team had completed a preliminary review of her background during the negotiation window, and although the data was incomplete, it showed repeated inconsistencies in her academic record, including sealed transcripts and fragmented institutional entries that suggested intentional restriction rather than absence. The words created a subtle ripple through the room, not of accusation, but of recalibration. Aaliyah did not react immediately, only lowering her gaze briefly before responding in a calm voice that records often failed to reflect the full scope of a person's path. Kenji nodded slightly, acknowledging the answer but not letting the subject close. Instead, he made a decision that surprised everyone present. He stated that effective immediately she would be formally appointed as lead linguistic verification consultant for the remainder of the contract, with authority to override any translation or interpretation that altered legal meaning. The executive team reacted with restrained shock, because such authority was typically reserved for certified international legal experts, not external staff. But Kenji's expression did not change, because in his mind the outcome of misunderstanding was far more expensive than the risk of restructuring hierarchy. Aaliyah finally looked up at him directly, and for the first time her expression carried a subtle uncertainty, not about capability, but about consequence. She asked quietly whether he understood what he was offering, and Kenji replied that he understood exactly, because for the first time since entering the room, the deal was no longer the most important variable. What mattered now was accuracy, trust, and the source from which clarity emerged. The interpreter lowered his head, quietly accepting that his role had effectively shifted into redundancy, while the executives began adjusting their internal strategy in real time. Kenji then gestured toward the remaining contract pages and asked her to continue guiding the next phase. But as Aaliyah prepared to proceed, her phone vibrated softly on the table, displaying an incoming institutional alert tied to her academic records, a notification that briefly revealed a partially restored file trail indicating advanced placement status in multiple language acquisition assessments that had never been publicly certified. Kenji noticed the screen before she could turn it away, and for a brief moment the room entered a stillness that felt different from negotiation silence, because this time it carried recognition, not confusion. And as Aaliyah met his gaze again, it became clear that what had begun as a translation correction had evolved into something far larger, a redefinition of visibility, value, and the quiet truth that some people were never missing from the system. They had simply never been properly seen within it. The conference room remained still, but the stillness had changed its nature. It was no longer uncertainty or confusion, but something closer to recognition, as if every person in the room had quietly accepted that the structure of authority they entered with was no longer fully intact. Aaliyah Johnson sat with her hands lightly resting on the edge of the contract folder, her expression controlled but no longer completely distant, because the weight of what had just been revealed on her phone had shifted the atmosphere around her in a way that could not be ignored. Kenji Nakamura watched her closely, not with suspicion now, but with a focused attention that came from recalculating value in real time. The executives around the table remained silent, waiting for the next instruction. While the interpreter no longer attempted to intervene at all, Kenji finally spoke, his voice steady but quieter than before, saying that before continuing the contract he needed clarity on something unrelated to numbers or clauses. He asked Aaliyah directly whether she had ever been formally recognized by any institution for her linguistic capability at an advanced level. The question was simple, but it carried weight because it was no longer about translation, it was about legitimacy. Aaliyah took a slow breath before answering, explaining that she had once been placed in an accelerated linguistic evaluation program during her academic years, but due to personal and family responsibilities she had withdrawn before final certification. She added that after leaving, her records became inconsistent due to administrative updates and privacy-related restrictions. Kenji listened without interruption, his gaze fixed but not pressing, as if he was comparing her answer against the incomplete data his team had retrieved. Then he nodded slightly and said something that immediately shifted the tone of the room again. He stated that regardless of formal certification, her performance inside the room had already exceeded the standard required for professional verification, and therefore he would be initiating an internal designation adjustment that would allow her to remain in the negotiation with official authority over linguistic accuracy. One of the senior executives immediately attempted to raise concern about corporate protocol and legal exposure, but Kenji stopped him with a single gesture, explaining that the greater risk was not procedural deviation but irreversible misinterpretation of contractual language worth billions of dollars. The room fell back into silence, not resistance, but reluctant acceptance. Aaliyah looked at Kenji with a restrained expression that suggested she was still processing the implication of what he was assigning to her. She asked quietly whether he understood that this level of responsibility would place her in a position that could influence final contractual outcomes. Kenji replied that he understood completely, and that was precisely the reason he had made the decision, because accuracy without authority was no longer sufficient in a negotiation of this scale. Aaliyah hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod, accepting the responsibility without celebration or hesitation, as if she had long been accustomed to stepping into roles that arrived without preparation. The interpreter finally lowered his head completely, recognizing that his function had shifted into observation rather than participation. While the executives adjusted their documents to align with Aaliyah's corrected translations in real time, the negotiation resumed, but the structure had changed permanently, every clause now passing through a dual layer of verification that had not existed before her intervention. Kenji remained attentive not only to the deal but to her responses, noticing how quickly she processed complex legal language, how precisely she identified subtle shifts in meaning that others missed entirely, and as the session continued, his focus gradually moved away from the contract itself and toward the realization that the most significant discovery of this negotiation was not a clause, a risk, or a valuation adjustment, but the presence of someone who had been operating at a level of understanding that the system had never formally acknowledged. And as the final documents of the day were prepared for review, Kenji quietly initiated a secure background escalation request through his private network, not to evaluate her usefulness anymore, but to understand why someone with her level of capability had remained invisible until the exact moment she was needed to prevent everything from collapsing. A secure notification finally arrived on Kenji Nakamura's device as the negotiation session was being prepared for final documentation review, and for a brief moment he did not open it, because the room itself had become more important than any external data stream. Aaliyah Johnson remained seated in the same position she had maintained for most of the session, her attention calm but fully engaged, as if she had stepped into a role that was never formally assigned yet. Now felt structurally unavoidable. The executives around the table were quietly reviewing corrected contract language based on her translations, no longer questioning her presence but integrating her input as a necessary condition for accuracy. Kenji finally opened the secure message, and the contents confirmed what had been partially indicated earlier. Her academic and linguistic record had not simply been incomplete, but selectively restricted across multiple institutional databases, with several high-level evaluation results marked as inaccessible under administrative protection protocols. He looked up slowly from the screen, and for the first time the silence in the room felt different, not like uncertainty, but like realization. Aaliyah noticed his expression shift and asked in a calm voice whether there was an issue with the documents. Kenji did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the device down and stated that her background contained discrepancies that could not be explained by ordinary academic withdrawal or incomplete certification. The room became still again, not tense but attentive because the tone had shifted from negotiation to understanding. Aaliyah responded carefully, explaining that she had never attempted to conceal her abilities. Only her circumstances had limited formal recognition, and that her focus had always been on survival rather than validation. Kenji listened without interruption, then nodded once and said that in his experience, the most valuable capabilities were often the ones that existed outside formal recognition systems. He then confirmed that the negotiation would proceed with her authority on all linguistic interpretation. Final and binding for the remainder of the session. One executive asked quietly whether this level of delegation had precedent in international contracts of this scale. Kenji answered that precedent was irrelevant when precision determined outcome. Aaliyah lowered her gaze briefly, not in discomfort but in reflection, as if processing the weight of responsibility that had now become formalized. The interpreter remained silent, fully stepping back from participation, while the executives adjusted their workflow to align with Aaliyah's real-time verification of each clause. As the final segments of the contract were reviewed, Kenji observed not only her accuracy but her consistency under pressure, noting that she did not attempt to assert authority beyond translation. Yet her presence effectively stabilized the entire negotiation structure. When the final clause was confirmed, the room remained quiet for several seconds, not because anything was unresolved, but because everyone understood that the outcome had been secured through a factor none of them had anticipated at the beginning of the day. Kenji stood slowly and formally acknowledged the completion of the negotiation phase, then turned toward Aaliyah and stated that her contribution had directly prevented a misinterpretation that could have altered the entire valuation structure. Aaliyah did not respond with celebration, only a small nod of acknowledgement, and as the executives began gathering their documents, Kenji paused briefly, looking at her with a focus that now extended beyond the contract itself, because what had begun as a translation correction had evolved into something far more significant, a recognition that the most powerful influence in the room had not been the agreement being signed, but the person who had ensured it was understood correctly in the first place.